all these honest, hardworking people are getting their money stolen, they're getting their life's work stolen, they're getting their retirement stolen, they're getting their kids' futures stolen, and your news agencies that are supposed to report about these things are, you know, they're out to lunch is the politest term that I could give it, but really, in effect, they are derelict in their duty, and they have betrayed the responsibility, and they've betrayed the trust of their audiences. So I can't understand why the American people are still subscribing to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and these other magazines and publications that are completely taking away any integrity or any context of the story that would allow you to actually get out of the fraud. Their job is to keep you in front of the fraud all the time so that these frauds can continue to perpetrate. And in the case of AIG, I mean, their actions in the past couple years are just the end result of what they've been doing for the past decade. And when you look into AIG's origins as the American International Company back in 1919 doing business out of China, there's a lot of interesting history with AIG that ties not only into the OSS and the CIA, it ties into 9/11, it ties into Elliot Spitzer and all sorts of other things. So they really don't want you to look into who got the bonuses at AIG, where that money went, how they paid off foreign banks with U.S. taxpayer money, and all this other sort of shenanigans that have gone on in the absence of a critical thinking media source covering events in America.
What exactly did your experiences lead you to realize?
It led me to realize that the agencies and organizations that are tasked with oversight in our American markets, in our United States financial markets, are at best helping to cover up the frauds that we're just now beginning to realize in progress. At worst, they're helping these guys to perpetrate these frauds, that the media is not responsible and cannot be trusted to report to the public on these frauds, and that the summation of all of this leads to the public having giant blind spots in their awareness wherein these frauds can be perpetrated, people can be preyed on, and the money's gone. And when you go to an authority like the SEC and say, I have witnessed fraud, I have evidence of fraud, here it is, and they're not interested in it, it's an early warning system. It's a type of protection racket. And when you blow the whistle as a corporate employee, whether it's to the general counsel of your company or you're going directly to the SEC, they're not interested in investigating the story and catching the bad guys. They're interested that you found out about it and got outside the company to tell the SEC. From there, it's really career suicide, because they let you think that there are these protections in place for whistleblowers, but when you get out there, in fact, these protections are used against the people blowing the whistle in many cases.
So why did you agree to this interview?
Nothing's more deadly to a creature of illusion and obscurity than light and clarity. And so the idea was to, within our own means, share this information, share some of the documentation, so that the average person out there who's being taken advantage of through this corporatized version of media suppression and censorship, letting you find your own way through the dark, can have an easier time, because we can make things a little less obscure by shedding a little light into these shadows where the media doesn't want you to explore.
How does Ayn Rand's philosophy contribute to the current economic downturn?
Nothing's more deadly to a creature of illusion and obscurity than light and clarity comes from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which is the blueprint, basically, or the operating system of the elite people who work to create these frauds and perpetrate them against the unwitting masses. I guess it's kind of because Atlas Shrugged was used as an inspiration by these elite executives to commit these acts of accounting fraud and control fraud. And the fact that we can take this information and use it for our benefit to expose these accounting frauds and these control frauds allows us to add to a dynamic that they're not planning.
Everybody is enslaved to everybody. Greenspan is a disciple. He is the great champion of government as a destructive force that just gets in the way. Greenspan talked about Rand in his autobiography. Rand stood in the Oval Office as a star pupil was sworn in. Greenspan had a very clear ideology about regulation. In 1987, Reagan made Greenspan the most powerful banker in the world, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Greenspan was a believer in Ayn Rand, a believer in free market. You may be curious for a central banker, because really central banking is a massive intervention in the markets and interest rates.
What reference could you recommend to simplify and explain the types of accounting and control fraud that was ongoing?
The best way to rob a bank is to own one, by Professor William Black. and it's regarding all of this sarbanes-oxley and this control fraud, so I just thought for a second I'd share it. This is page 247. It's important to understand fraud mechanisms. Control frauds were consistently able to fool top economists because they did not understand how CEOs turn accountants and accounting principles from a restraint into a weapon of fraud and a shield against the regulators. Economists receive no training about fraud risk, incidents, or mechanisms. Lawyers receive no fraud training. Right? And this is kind of what led up to the Enron scandal. The lawyers and the accountants aren't familiar with what fraud looks like. They're not being trained to recognize it. The average accountant receives no meaningful training about fraud and no training at all about control fraud. Control fraud is not random.
How did you earn your first $1 million before you were 30?
How did I earn my first million before I was 30? Through the effective use of rhetoric and persuasive speech, otherwise known as corporate sales.
Are you willing to share what you've learned through your experience in executive sales and consequent whistleblowing with the audience?
Well, I've mentioned that I don't know of any university that gives a degree in sales, and we can also get into that later, why they don't give out that information to just anybody. But if I shared in deep detail everything that I've learned, then you'd be left to believe me. And that's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is to teach you how to learn by presenting you with some of these different components, because it doesn't do me any good for you to believe me. What would do me a lot of good is for other people on the other side of the screen to start to understand these control mechanisms, these fraud mechanisms, how to realize it, to recognize that the media that you're paying for you're paying for lies. You're not getting the truth you need to make informed decisions. And so rather than me sharing and you just listening and believing, I would like you to actively participate, give some thought to what I'm saying, maybe take some notes, do some research, and maybe even email and follow up afterwards, because I'm interested to find out, there are millions of people who have been ripped off by these frauds, and there are trillions of dollars that have been stolen from the American people. So I know that there are people out there with resources that can take the information that we're trying to put out and give us the extra boost to be able to get it in front of people. But the first thing you need to understand is the frauds as I've experienced them, and what I've experienced through trying to go to Frontline and these other media outlets that call themselves investigative journalists, when really they're just looking to present you with a story that lets you think that something's being taken care of. They'll show you one whistleblower. Oh, here's the woman from Halliburton, and isn't her story great? But they won't show you the 500 other whistleblowers that allow you to see these frauds from a comprehensive 360-degree Google Earth type of perspective, where you could do something about it and effectively pass on what you've learned, which is what we're trying to do here.
Who specifically did you approach at PBS Frontline to investigate your claims and publish your evidence?
The reporter we went to at Frontline was named Lowell Bergman.
What made you trust in Frontline, and specifically in Lowell Bergman?
A couple weeks before I contacted Lowell Bergman, I had screened a film with Russell Crowe, and Lowell Bergman was portrayed in the film by Al Pacino. It was called The Insider, and it's about this whistleblower named John Wigand, and he worked for a cigarette company named Brown & Williamson. He was in a similar situation to what I found myself in. He faxed Lowell Bergman in the movie, so I thought, why not look up, this guy's fax number, send him a fax. We corresponded with Bergman. He said, yes, send me all of your evidence. Sent a big box of evidence out there with voice recordings and legal documents and all this evidence that I'd collected through what I'd been through that far in my court case. And he had two people working on the investigation of checking out these documents and checking out my claims, and more importantly, the connections that my claims were pointing to between the White House and the founder of the company that I was working at, and the Sarbanes-Oxley regulations and the SEC's role in these events. And after a year and a half, I was told that he couldn't do anything for me, that one of the editors had been fired, that the other editor's job at the San Francisco Chronicle had his career threatened, and decided he wanted to keep his career. And so after a year and a half of believing that this information was going to make it to the American people vis-a-vis Frontline, I had to come to the realization that there are some entities out there, in fact, many entities, that benefit specifically from you not getting this information.
What was the gist of what you sought Bergman to investigate?
I wasn't so much interested in Frontline doing a story on me. What I found to be interesting was, after I had identified that there was a backdoor in the product that I was selling, and the product I was selling was Sarbanes-Oxley regulation software that was being used by financial services company across all over the world, but specifically across America. And once I understood that the purpose of Sarbanes-Oxley regulations was to keep these companies from deleting files, and that the backdoor in the software allowed these companies to delete files, and more importantly, the fact that